All right, guys, in Unit 1.5b, we're going to be focusing on negative externalities of consumption and production, all right? So let's go ahead and jump into it. We are first going to start with the negative externalities of production, and then we'll get into consumption. So, remembering back to our previous video, is that big enough? No. Remembering back to our previous video, all right? Remember that demand is equal to marginal private benefit for the private individual consumers experiencing utility, marginal amounts of utility through consumption. But if there's no negative or positive consumption externalities, then because the individual private consumers are a part of society, then they are also equal to the marginal social benefit. Marginal private benefit is also equal to marginal social benefit if there are no consumption externalities. All right. You also remember too from the previous unit that supply is equal to marginal private costs, because as the producer produces additional units of output, they're going to have increasing additional costs as well. So that's why the supply is equal to marginal private entrepreneurial cost of the producer. If there are no negative or positive production externalities, then marginal private cost will be equal to marginal social cost, as the individual producers are members of society themselves. All right? But today we're going to be focusing on the negative externalities, and we're going to start with production externalities. So what happens if there's a negative production externality? Well, first, let's get the original price, original quantity in there. Well, as we can see, let's get into it. So what happens if there's a negative production externality? What does this mean? Well, this means that the production of a particular product will have negative spillover effects, negative production externalities, on the rest of society, otherwise known as the bystanders who are not participants in the market. So if there's a negative production externality, in the model, it's going to look like this. It's going to be a leftward shift. Why? Well, once we have a negative production externality, or in other words, the production of the product has negative spillover effects on society, well, now we're in a situation where the marginal social cost is no longer equal to the marginal private cost of the producer. Because of the negative spillover effects on society, the marginal social costs are going to be greater than the marginal private costs. All right? So for instance, let's say we're looking at the market of oil. Let's say this is the oil refining market. And so as a company, as a firm, the major input here is going to be crude oil. The firm buys or invests in crude oil. It then invests in other capital products and labor to then refine that crude oil into gasoline or some other form of petroleum. All right? Well, it turns out that when refining crude oil into gasoline, the refining process actually creates a lot of carbon emissions that the community will then breathe, right? Because that will then dilute the quality of the air of the community where the refining is taking place. And that community is represented by this marginal social cost line, compared to the private refining companies that are represented by the marginal private cost line. All right? Well, the company has to incur the private costs of refining, but because of the carbon emissions that it produces, the society, the individuals within that community will have higher healthcare costs. They'll have to allocate more of their income to medical costs as the quality of their air diminishes and they start to get diseases and illness associated with that environmental degradation. So as a consequence of this, we can see in the market that the optimal price for refining gasoline or refining crude oil is represented by where the marginal social cost intersects the marginal social benefit. And so because of that, this new price represents the socially optimal price, whereas the original price was the market price. And as we raise the price of refining oil closer to that what is socially optimal, then there is going to be less crude oil being refined. And so therefore we'll have a more socially optimal amount of carbon emissions as a consequence of limiting the refining process. And that's represented by a shift from the quantity that's being produced in the market to the optimal, to the quantity that's produced for that's socially optimal or best for society. Well, how do we show the harm to society in the model? What we would call dead weight loss in previous units is we would take that quantity that's being the quantity that's being produced and consumed in the market, go up to the new marginal social cost line from that, and here is our dead weight loss triangle. This shows us the harm to society that's occurring as a consequence of the refining of crude oil into gasoline because of the carbon emissions and the environmental degradation of the breathable air. Because the breathable air is getting worse, people will have higher healthcare costs, and so that diminishes their standard of living as they have to allocate more of their income to medical costs instead of paying off their house or paying off their car or taking their family on vacations. Excuse me. All right. So here, the marginal social cost line in relation to the marginal social benefit line tells us what the socially optimal output of gasoline will be and what the socially optimal price of refining gasoline would be compared to what's happening in the market, which was our original situation. Now, how do we correct for this then? Now that we know what the problem is, and now that we know we can understand better how it's negatively affecting society, how do we correct it? Well, first of all, you might be able to see that this is technically this would be a demerit good by definition, because we have more of the product being produced than what is best for society. Ceteris paribus, of course. So how do we correct for this then? How do we correct for this? These negative spillover effects from the producer. Well, we have several options that we can employ. All right, we can impose a tax on the oil refining companies, and by imposing a tax, what we do, if you guys remember with our tax unit, it would shift the supply curve, which the supply curve represents marginal private cost. It would shift the supply curve to the left. So you'd have a new line that you would title marginal private cost plus a tax. And by the government imposing a tax, it's going to diminish the productive possibilities of the refining companies, which is going to diminish their ability to produce, to refine oil. As a consequence, there will be less oil refined and therefore less carbon emissions produced as a consequence. As you can see from a shift from MPC to MPC plus tax. As a consequence of this, what happens to the dead weight loss triangle? The dead weight loss triangle diminishes significantly, as you can see here. So it goes from that bigger triangle to this smaller triangle. And as a consequence of the tax, the quantity of refined oil in the free market will fall from QM to QT, quantity taxed, which gets us closer to the quantity that is more socially optimal and Q opt. All right? And it also raises the price of refining oil from PM to PT, from the price in the market to the price that's being taxed. And again, that gets us closer to the price that is socially optimal for refining oil. All right? So a tax is one way in which we can correct, or what's called internalize, the externality. Another way we can correct for the externality is to not impose a tax, but perhaps we could just impose a government regulation. We could say, okay, from now on, oil refiners are only allowed to refine certain amounts of gasoline. And so that's not a tax, that's actually a regulation. And so the marginal private cost plus government regulation is another way in which we can internalize or correct the negative production externality. All right? Now we're going to go over more examples in class, but just to save time, I'm going to go ahead and finish up the conversation on negative production externalities. But there are other strategies that can be used to correct for these externalities, such as cap and trade, tradable permits, and things like this, and we'll explore those more in class. So hang on to your outlines for that reason. So now that we've finished this, we are going to move on to our discussion. We're going to now